So many Resident Evil fans would consider Resident Evil 4 to be a perfect game, which I would definitely have to agree to, but even in a perfect game there will always be room for improvement. In this video, I will be having an in-depth discussion on ways Capcom's Resident Evil 4 Remake could improve from the original. This video will include how Capcom could improve every character, every setting in the game, and also some minor details that could be added. Before we jump into the video, if you are excited for the Resident Evil 4 Remake, then maybe consider subscribing, because I've got a lot more content and discussion videos coming soon regarding the game. But anyways, with that out of the way, let's get right into the video.
Resident Evil 4.
First off, let's talk about the settings, starting with the village. One way they can always improve is by adding new enemies. With all the black crows flying around, something seems to be missing, and that is scarecrows. This would be a perfect fit for the farm style the village has, and would make for a very terrifying new enemy. With this enemy, they can incorporate jump scares by having them jump out at Leon when you approach the scarecrows. Next thing would be a much creepier tone and atmosphere. I loved what I saw in the trailer, having the dark nighttime setting and the foggy atmosphere. If they can include these same details throughout most of the village, then it opens up many opportunities that make the village much scarier. Next, we got Dr. Salvador. I'm sure you have heard many people by now talk about stalker roles for the chainsaw guy. Some dislike the idea, but me personally, I really think it opens up many opportunities to make the village much scarier. Hearing the faint sound of a chainsaw rev deep in the woods could really add suspense. Altering Dr. Salvador's appearance could also give players chills, and making him more aggressive and increasing his speed will have players on the edge of their seat. I believe that there are many opportunities for Dr. Salvador. All we can do is hope Capcom will deliver. Next, let's talk about the castle section of the game. So my first idea has to do with the Plaga Knights. These enemies would make such a great opportunity for jump scares if there were no QuickTime events. In getting rid of these QuickTime events for the Knights, Capcom could make some Knights simply jump out at you, catching you off guard. The next thing I want to bring up is Capcom giving the Vertigo a stalker type role in the castle, as I feel like this enemy would be a perfect fit for the role due to its highly developed senses that were revealed in the Vertigo boss fight. Once again, stalker roles are an easy way to make the game have a much scarier experience, so I feel like this would help out a lot, as the castle doesn't really have anything scary about it. Castle expansion. The castle is enormous and I feel like it fully wasn't explored by Leon. The game featured all the big and impactful locations but didn't bother including little things like kitchens, dining halls, and the rooms of the castle members. So with that said, I would like to see more exploration and locations. By doing this, Capcom has the opportunity to include new enemies, new puzzles, and maybe even some new bosses. Lore. In the RE4 Remake, I believe more backstory revealed about the Salazar family is much needed. Sure, we got a lot of files revealing brief information, but still there are many questions left unanswered. In the castle files, we learn that the Salazar family is the creator of the Los Illuminados cult, so they had full control over the Plaga. We come to find out that Sadler convinced Salazar to release the Plaga virus, which led the infection to spread across the castle. Instead of giving us files with important info like this, why not make it into a cutscene, or maybe even future DLC? By doing this, we can have a much better perspective on these vital parts of the game's story. Lastly, I want to talk about the infamous Hookman enemy from the beta version of Resident Evil 4. I believe that the castle would be a perfect entry point for him. With this enemy, maybe he could play a stalker type role, or maybe even an additional boss fight. Next, let's talk about the last setting in the game, the island. First, I want to bring up the regenerators. These enemies are a staple of Resident Evil 4, being known as one of the scariest creatures in a video game with the disturbing sounds that they make. With the newly updated RE engine, I feel like Capcom really needs to capitalize on the regenerators and make them as terrifying as possible. The perfect way to do this is by expanding the character models of the regenerators. Maybe they could use some of the unused models we saw in the freezer room. Capcom could also make the regenerators a lot more aggressive and chase after Leon when they spot you. This would easily make them so much more terrifying and would have fans running away to go hide in a nearby room. Once again, I really hope Capcom takes the extra time to perfect these regenerators, because I believe they have opportunities to alter them into the most terrifying creature ever created in a Resident Evil game. Aside from this, they also need to add more lab sequences on the island. By doing this, the island can somewhat stray away from the heavy action areas and include some scary settings instead. Less repetition. So don't get me wrong, the first few playthroughs of the island are very enjoyable. It's a much different approach from the previous castle and village sequences of the game, as the island takes a much heavier action approach. Don't get me wrong, this is very fun at first, but after you play through Resident Evil 4 a few times, the island starts to get almost repetitive with combat and similar enemies. For some players, this might have even led to less replayability. Now, one way they can stray away from this repetition is by adding some new types of enemies. This is where adding more lab sequences would come into play. I feel like Capcom could easily add a disturbing new enemy that was part of some twisted, failed experiment alongside the regenerators. Not only would this spice the island up a bit, but it also opens up yet another opportunity to make the game a lot scarier. Less action. Looking back, I feel like the island had way too much action, to an extent, and straight away from what the Resident Evil series is all about, being survival horror. With that said, I feel like it would be necessary to tone down the action a little bit. I'm not saying take it all out, but definitely tone it down a bit to where it doesn't feel like you're playing a first-person shooter game. Now let's talk about the characters of Resident Evil 4, starting off with Ashley. As we know, Ashley's screaming and shouting can get annoying really quickly, so it might be in the interest of the Resident Evil 4 remake to make her act her age a little bit more and give her a character that has more depth than simply someone who's just in constant need of being rescued. Ashley is certainly a memorable part of Resident Evil 4, but she's not necessarily memorable for the best reasons. If the remake were to give Ashley a lot more depth and potentially tie her into the broader RE canon, she might even leave a bigger impact than she did in the original. Another issue with Ashley is the fact that she is completely useless. A way Capcom can make her useful is by giving Ashley a small defensive object, like a pocket knife or a torch, similar to what we saw with Moria Burton in Resident Evil Revelations 2. This could give a little room to defend herself while Leon makes his way towards her. Obviously, she isn't going to be a character to kill and fight, but a few fixes in her behavior would go a long way. Also, while Leon is fending off zombies, Ashley could go around and find things like ammo and health for Leon during combat. By giving Ashley some sort of agency in the overall gameplay, Capcom could turn Ashley into a beloved part of an already precious game. Ashley's playable sections are totally missed opportunities as well. In the current version of Resident Evil 4, you swap to Ashley, solve a few puzzles, fend off some enemies, and then return to playing as Leon. So with that said, it would definitely be interesting to see them expand these chapters in the remake. It would definitely be an interesting change of pace after so many hours getting used to mowing down zombies to suddenly becoming underpowered and unable to fight back. The original had the same idea, only it became tedious and frustrating because there was no real threat. As a result, this would be a perfect time to re-implement the Hookman enemy. Adding him as a very real threat to Ashley would definitely up the stakes of these sections. Alongside this, Ashley's section would also be a perfect time to add some terrifying experiences, specifically when she goes down into the dark storage room filled with a plague of knights. These knights were so slow, so once you pass them by, you are in the clear. So instead, they could scrap the knights completely and add some sort of disturbing locked up creature down there that breaks free and aggressively chases you back to the entrance while being on your tail the whole time. Luis Serra. I think we can all agree that Luis was a character that had so much potential and he died too soon. With that said, I really think Capcom should consider expanding his role in the remake. One way to go about this is by having him team up with Leon or Ada. Now, I'm not saying to include him in every chapter, but it would definitely be a neat change every few chapters having a companion fighting alongside you. With Luis Serra's expanded role, I would really like to see him get his very own separate campaign. With this campaign, they could even go more into the lore by playing out his scenario before Leon showed up. Lastly, I really think he needs to be a playable character in the Mercenaries game mode. The Merchant. The Merchant is a very mysterious character that to this day we still know little to nothing about him. So with that said, why not unveil the story behind the Merchant in the remake? I have heard a lot of fans want the Merchant to remain mysterious, since that is what makes him such an interesting and loved character. But after the release of Resident Evil 8, I think Capcom has other plans. The dude quoted the familiar phrase, "What are you buying?" saying it was something an old friend of his used to say. Ever since that, we know that there is something more to the Merchant than meets the eye, and I really think they should uncover how they know each other in the remake. Now my next idea goes along with the famous theory of the Merchant being Luis's grandfather. As we know, Luis didn't get the screen time he deserved, even though he played a significant role. So with that said, a lot of fans want a separate campaign story for Luis. If they do end up giving Luis his own scenario, and if the Merchant is indeed Luis's grandfather, then it would make sense if the two of them teamed up in Luis's campaign. Maybe this tag team could be something similar to Chris and Sheva teaming up in Resident Evil 5. If this did happen, then it would be a great opportunity to learn more about the mysterious Merchant. Jack. Jack Krauser played a significant role in Resident Evil 4, specifically during the island section, as he is the one that kidnapped Ashley and acted as somewhat of a secondary antagonist, with a pretty cool boss fight to go along with him. Just like most characters I talked about, I would like to see Krauser receive more explanation of his backstory. They really didn't go into much detail about his role in the Resident Evil series, and his past mission he went on with Leon. And to be honest, I kinda see this as an issue, because there have been many new fans that have just started to get into the series with the release of the RE2 and 3 remakes and Resident Evil Village. So with that said, many people will have no idea who he is if they don't reveal his backstory with Leon. And that is why I think it is vital that they talk about his story. They don't have to go too in depth, but instead give a few flashbacks and give a little more dialogue in the knife battle with Krauser, which leads me to my next point. I would love to see the knife battle with Krauser reworked. I do believe it had the opportunity to be an amazing boss fight between the two, but instead it was sadly just reduced to a quick time event. Sure, his initial entrance could be a quick time event and then go into a cutscene, but then from there it would start the boss fight. And when you do enough damage to him, that's when the quick time event cutscene could continue, where Krauser is about to kill Leon, and then Ada would proceed to save you. Next thing I would like to see is an extra game mode where we play Krauser's scenario. Ever since playing RE4, I thought that Luis and Krauser deserved a mini story section, because not only is it more content, but it gives us a better look on their perspectives during the game. They can go more in depth about his backstory, showing him teaming up with Wesker and going to the Ganado Island to infiltrate the Los Illuminados and steal a sample of the Plaga. From here it could show how he teamed up with Sadler and go on to continue the rest of his story in the main scenario. Hunnigan. So, in the beginning of the trailer, we see Leon at the White House having a mission briefing with the president. With the scene, it is possible that there might be a small playable section of Leon exploring the White House. If that is the case, then I would love to see more screen time for Hunnigan during this section, so we can get a better connection with her early on in the game. Moving on to Leon and Ada, in my opinion, they were both two characters that had very solid roles in the game. The only thing I will say is that Ada Wong's Separate Ways campaign could have been better. It left out many unnecessary things that could have given us a better understanding on her perspective throughout the game. Aside from that, I do believe that their roles were executed pretty well. Please be sure to let me know down in the comments below if you disagree, and if so, I would love to hear your own ideas on how they could improve Ada and Leon's role. Now let's talk about the three main bosses of the game. Me personally, they all had pretty solid roles in the game, but something to note is that even though all of them make appearances throughout the game, we only interact with them through cutscenes and radio transmissions leading up to the final fight with each of them. So maybe they could add additional boss fights with these antagonists, just so we can get a better understanding of them and spice things up. Maybe it could be something similar to William Birkin, where every time you fight these enemies, they can mutate into something much bigger and stronger. Aside from this, I think Chief Mendez could play a perfect fit for a stalker role in the Village. Also, I think they could give Salazar a much more serious tone in the remake, as many fans found him outright annoying. Next, I just want to cover a few little details that I personally think could go a long way with improving the game. The first feature would be the dodge mechanic we saw in the Resident Evil 3 remake. It worked very well in my opinion, and with the action-heavy gameplay of Resident Evil 4, I believe that it could work just as well in the RE4 remake. Next thing is character models. With the RE engine, I would really like for them to make the enemies in the game as terrifying as possible, and also add a few new ones to freshen the game up. Based on what we have seen so far with the first trailer, I would say that Capcom is doing a great job with these models. Lastly, I want to talk about the darker tone for the game. After the trailer we have just received, there is no doubt about it that Capcom is taking a much serious, darker, and scarier approach for the game. This is much needed, as the original wasn't scary at all. However, I really want to emphasize the fact that they need to keep the heavy action, because that is what made the game what it is today. They really have the opportunity to improve the game by making it scarier, but I personally feel like they also have the opportunity to make the game much worse if they take away from the action segments we all know and love from the original.